everybody. Hopefully you're doing really great today. We're going to start off with lists. Hopefully you've looked at our Instagram. It offers a really good introduction to the topic of lists. We'll start with talking about how to make a list in Python. So starting off where our Instagram post briefly mentioned, then talking about how to access certain elements on a list, and then we'll be comparing a string with a list for you and showing you that they're actually much more similar than you think. And hopefully that should make the topic of lists a little less intimidating. As I mentioned on our Instagram post, lists are best thought of like grocery lists. Whenever you need to go shopping, you write a list of all the things you need, and they're elements and you can add them and you can take away items as you don't need them anymore. And so I'm talking about some of the more advanced functionality, but list is really best thought of as a grocery list. To continue with that trend, let's go ahead and define our first list, shopping list. That is a variable name. And the list will have 3 items: onions, bell peppers, and cheese. This should look pretty familiar because this is the variable. The equals is how we define a variable. This square bracket right here is what defines the list. It tells Python that everything inside this is the list. And these are called elements. The shopping items in this case are elements. And if you run it, it should do nothing because, like I mentioned, this is just defining a variable, and defining a variable doesn't really do much. And because you're here and you're pretty advanced in Python, you want to do more than just define a variable, and we will now start using some of these items for things. One interesting functionality that Python allows you, and most other programming languages allow you to do with lists, is you can access the elements. And what that means is if you want to know what the second item on the list is, you can find that out. The way to do that, though, we have to first talk about how Python names its elements. Most people would call this the first element, the second element, and the third element. However, Python does not. And again, most other programming languages do not. They call the first element the 0th element, the second element the first element, and the third element the second element, and so on. There is a reason that they do this, and I'll actually talk about it in the description below of our YouTube. But I would just accept it as fact, and just always remember that the first element of a list is actually the 0th element in terms of computers. So if I want to access what the first element of the list is, and from now on whenever I talk about an element, I'm referring to it in the computer way. So the first element of the list, which is bell peppers, what I can do is I can call the variable shopping list, add the square brackets to let it know that it's a list, and add 1 to ask it to tell me what the index is. This is called index. And then, because I want to actually know what that information is, I will ask it to print. As you can see, Python it found the first element of the list, bell peppers, and it printed it for me. And you can continue to do this with all of the elements of the list. And let's actually do one with an error. As you can see, there is no 4th element of the list, and Python will give you an index error, which basically means that there's no index or element after this one. Now that we've talked about how list indexes work, let's talk about strings. We have worked with strings before. Let's actually define one right now and call it name equals teens code. This is a string, we have worked with it before, but you can actually do a lot of the same things with strings that you can do with lists. For example, to do the indexing that we did right here, we know that T is the 0th element, E, the first E is the first, the second E is the second, and so on, of this string teens code. And so if I want to know what the second element of a string is, I can do the same thing I just did with lists and ask it to print. I should probably fix this. As you can see, it gave me an E because this is the second element of the list. Let's continue on and play with it some more. The sixth element, it's an O. A ninth element, as you can see, it gives us an index error because it's out of range. One thing you should note is that these are not the same. This is a string, this is a list, but they do all have indexes. And this is something that we'll explore more in the upcoming topics. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was very helpful, and I hope that you have a great day.